Coming up next on the Holistic Wealth Podcast.
The two boys went up, my brother Ian and my cousin Peter went up, and we just, we're all going out the door, and there was a huge explosion because they picked up a Mills bomb, and Peter picked it up and banged it on the ground, and nothing left. My brother Ian he had holes all over his body, and it was quite a nightmare for all of us, and particularly for Aunt Rose and Uncle Charlie. I mean, it was their boy.
You're listening to the Holistic Wealth Podcast with host Keisha Blair, author of Holistic Wealth and founder of the Institute on Holistic Wealth. And now, here's your host, Keisha Blair.
Welcome to the Holistic Wealth Podcast, and I'm your host, Keisha Blair, and today I have a very special guest with us, and our guest is Joy Fox. I read about Joy in an article by Mia Taylor, who was a previous guest on this podcast. You can check out her show after this episode is through. And she wrote this amazing story on Joy's life in the BBC, and it turned out to be one of the top most loved stories of 2024. And they announced it in December 2024. And I saw that. I fell in love with Joy's story, and she's our guest today on the podcast. Now, Joy has been traveling the world at 89 solo, and her story is just amazing. She sold her engagement ring, and it began a lifetime of seeing the world. And, this began in 1956. That's when Joy, then 20 years old and living in a small town in England, began to consider the world beyond her village. And so I have Joy with me today to share the story herself. Joy, welcome to the Holistic Wealth Podcast. I'm so excited to have you here to share your journey with our listeners who all love travel. Like myself, it's one of my great passions. So Joy, thanks for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's so great to have you here, Joy. And I just wanted to mention before I get into the questions that you were also awarded the Journey Woman Evelyn Hannon Award for solo travel from Journey Woman. That's a global organization dedicated to promoting solo travel for women over 50. And Joy, if we could start from the very beginning, at the point of heartbreak, when you sold your engagement ring, what was that like for you? What were you thinking at that tender age, and how that prompted you to start this journey?
First, I was in love with him. We'd been going together for 4 years, so to be hit with that was a bit of a surprise. We were planning a wedding, but he'd gone to live in London. He was in the insurance business, and I guess he must have met somebody at the company Christmas party, because in the January of 1956, I got a Dear Joy letter, not a Dear John, a Dear Joy, saying he'd met somebody else and could he please have the ring back because it was a family heirloom. And I was devastated and did nothing about it for a time and cried and, whined and moaned. But eventually, it took me 2 or 3 weeks, and my mum arranged for me to go up to Berkshire and stay with friends of hers to have a little break away from the village, because everybody knew, that's it with a small village. Everybody knew. And they were all saying, oh, look, she's being jilted. And so I got away and went to Berkshire for a couple of weeks with friends. And when I came back, I thought, I felt a little better. And I thought, no way am I sending the ring back. It's time I sold it and did something with it. And my mother had traveled when she was married to my father. They went to India and Egypt and China, because he was in the military, so he was posted. So she was always talking about these places. And my brother had just come back from Italy. He'd been to Venice, and he bought me a beautiful pair of earrings. And I was just about to sell this ring. So he sold it for me. He worked in London, so he sold it for me and brought me money back. And I thought, well, I'm going to go to Italy now. So I booked it with a travel agent. And I don't know. I was a little fearful, I must admit, because I really hadn't been out of the village since we lived there after the war. And but it worked out so well. I got myself to the Italian Riviera, to Rapallo, which it's very close to the bigger known places, but Portofino and Santa Margherita. But Rapallo was a quieter place. And it was wonderful. The very first day there, I had met a couple of girls on the boat going over because it was, before the Eurostar and all of that came into place. We went across the channel on a boat and then took a train through France and Switzerland and arrived on the Italian Riviera. So that was a big adventure. And I met a couple of girls on the boat and they were actually staying in the same hotel as I was. We were going to go dancing that night. We said, right, we're going to, all go dancing together. But I fell asleep. They went off on their travels without me. And when I woke up, I thought, oh, I'm going to find them. So I went for a walk and I heard the music over the ocean. It was Volare. It was very popular at the time. And I thought, oh, I bet they're in there. But when I went in, I was the only blonde in the room. And I can still feel all those brown eyes looking at me. So they lined up and, the Italian boys lined up because they all wanted to dance with me. So I kind of danced the night away. And this one kept coming around more than the others. And his name was Luigi. Mm-hmm. And he didn't speak English and I didn't speak Italian. So it was, it was gestures and a little word here and there. And he just told everybody to basically buzz off because he was going to walk me back to the hotel, which he did. And he was just a lovely gentleman, absolutely gorgeous, Keisha.
Yeah.
Young George Clooney, if you can imagine, gorgeous. And he turned up the next morning while I was having breakfast with the girls and he had his scooter outside. And the next 2 weeks, he took me everywhere along the Riviera to all the smaller places, Camoli, Zoala, Sestrilivante and Portofino, Santa Margherita. So I had absolutely a wonderful 2 weeks being escorted by this, gorgeous Italian Luigi. It was just lovely. I was never really in love with him, but I thought, okay, I feel much better about myself now. And when I went back home, I thought, well, I was pretty brave to do that, and it worked out really well. And I managed to get myself back again. And I think that was when the bug started, that I really thought, okay, once I can do it again.
Yeah.
So we had made plans to emigrate at that time because we were very poor in England and Mum couldn't get a council house. So we knew that if we wanted a better life, we had to leave the country. So we were planning to emigrate in 1958. And 1957 came around and Luigi came to England and I showed him around and, took him to all the hotspots in London and around where I lived. But we both knew it wasn't going anywhere because I was going to Canada. He was staying in Italy. There were, strict Catholics and they'd had tragedy in their family during the war. So I knew that he wasn't going to leave his mother and, his siblings. And that was fine. We parted as friends and he gave me back my confidence and the fact that I felt good about myself now.
Yeah.
And could move on and, move on with my life, which I did.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. So I just want to backtrack just a bit because you mentioned the war and I would love for viewers to get a sense from you what that was like. You mentioned living in that small village and the war had just ended. Can you just give us an idea, if you can remember, what that was like during that time?
I can remember very well. I'm doing my memoir at the moment, and the first part is the war years from birth up until basically when we emigrated in 58. So I got it down. I'm in the editing stage right now, but it's not something, living through the war, it's not something you ever forget, particularly as a child. And my father had, just before the war began, we had moved from Scotland to several places in Hertfordshire and ended up in Ashford in Middlesex. And just before the war started, this would be 1938, my father left my mother and left her with 4 children and went and lived with a girlfriend in London. So that devastated my mum, but we lived in a military house in Ashford, and eventually it was bombed. So we were, out on the street with nothing but a trunk full of possessions that she had decided were essential for us should it ever happen, which it did. And we were then, the next few years, we were evacuated to St. Albans, which was considered far enough away from where the major bombing was taking place, because Ashford was still is very close to where Heathrow Airport is now. So it was kind of a major area that was being bombed, particularly during the Blitz. So they moved us to St. Albans. And in those days, people who had a spare bedroom were pretty much forced to give it over to a family, so that because a lot of people had no homes after they were bombed. And we were now in that category, mum and the 4 kids. So we were assigned a bedroom in a house in St. Albans. We had to do everything. And I mean, everything in that room. We were not allowed to use the bathroom to go to the toilet. We had to use a bucket in the room. Yeah. And, with 3 boys and a girl and mum, it was pretty difficult. But mum had saved a big jar of fancy beads, and she made beaded curtains to give a little separation to various activities in the room.
Right.
And eventually, people don't really want a lot of strangers living in their house. So, you're asked to move. And so we did. The next house they sent us to was just absolute disaster for my mum, because it was filthy, and it was owned by an old man who was disgustingly filthy too. And he didn't want us in, and he locked us out on various occasions. And eventually Mum had to borrow a ladder to get in, to get all our possessions out of the bedroom, because he'd bolted the door and wouldn't let us in. So we slept on the street that night, and eventually went to one of the town shelters. In those days, there was a lot of air raid shelters that were built for the town. If you're out and about, you take, you go into the shelters and take refuge. So we slept in those for a couple of nights, and then the area council found us another place, which was above a Christian Science reading room. So we were given a bigger room there, and it had 2 beds. So, we could all sleep separately finally. And we lived there until 1942. And Mum got rather fed up with it, because she missed her family, who were in Rowhedge in Essex, which was also kind of apart from where the bombing was going on. The bombing was a lot worse than London and the big cities. So, she wrote to her sister and said, could we, come and live with you? And Rose said yes. Now, it wasn't just Rose and her husband. My granny lived there. Plus, they had 8 children and 1 grandchild living there in a 3-bedroom house. So it was already pretty crowded. Yeah. But when we got there, they had are you familiar with the Morrison shelter? In the ward was a great big iron table that people used instead of a dining room table. And we, a lot of us just slept underneath it. And that's, during air raids or when the siren went, we'd all huddle under the Morrison table or in a closet, or just somewhere where you didn't feel the roof was going to collapse on you. All it could have. But, when we were in the Anderson shelter in Ashford, I always felt that if a bomb did fall on us, that we'd be buried alive. So the Morrison shelter felt a lot better, to be in the house under an iron table. So we lived there until 1943. August 17th was Mum's birthday. And the boys had been blackberrying. And beyond this 3-bedroom council house was a big field where the military did their exercises. And that also meant exploding bombs. Okay, so the boys went over and picked blackberries and came back with a great big sack on their shoulders. Not many blackberries, but they had picked up a bomb, apparently. So we had lunch, and they hustled up the garden, and I wanted to go. I think I was 6 years old, and I said, no, I want to see what you've got. You've got stuff. And the 2 boys went up. My brother Ian and my cousin Peter went up, and we just, we're all going out the door, and there was a huge explosion because they picked up a Mills bomb, and Peter picked it up and banged it on the ground, and nothing left.
Wow.
My brother Ian he had holes all over his body, and it was quite a nightmare for all of us, and particularly for Aunt Rose and Uncle Charlie. I mean, it was their boy. Our boy was okay, actually. He had shrapnel come out of his body for years, but he was okay. He went to hospital and, they picked out the shrapnel. And after that, Mum knew that she couldn't stay there any longer because there was such grief.
Yes.
And so she found a little cottage just across the river in Wivenhoe in Essex, and it had already been condemned a number of times. So she had found it, and it was, I think, £1 a week, something like that. So we hustled everything into the trunk and took the ferry over, and carried the trunk through the village to this little house. And it was a dreadful little house. It had mice and rats and cockroaches and bed bugs and spiders. You name it. It already had a lot of inhabitants. But we lived there for 15 years and made the best of it. But and it was good, That was 1953, and the war ended in 1945, and there was celebrations everywhere and street parties, and so everybody felt a little free again and happy that Hitler had not invaded us. And, during the war, Churchill's wonderful, I don't know, and his speeches, they were just wonderful, and they kept us going. We wouldn't miss listening to one because he kept our spirits up, and, we're going to fight them in the streets. And we all felt, he's never going to get to us. Hitler did get to the Channel Isles, and but he never set foot actually on English soil. So, after the war, we were at school and just, going about our lives, but things were not getting any better for my mother. She couldn't, because she didn't have a husband at that time. Mm-hmm. They would not give a house to a woman on her own, even though eventually we're all earning money.
Yeah.
2 of the boys, signed up. One was called up for the RAF. The other one went into the Fleet Air Arm. And Ian never went to, there was something wrong with him. I forget what it was. But he never went in the forces. But, we went through so much in those days. It was a shameful time for me because people wanted to know, where's your dad? And I said, well, I don't know. I think he died in the war. I didn't want to say he left my mum. That was shameful. Yeah. It took me a long while to get over the shame of how poor we were and how we had to dress because we had no money until we were earning money.
Yeah.
And what my mum had to do to make money, she would go and do any job that came up to make money to keep us going. And, when it came to buying clothes, and I didn't really start my clothes habit until I was about 16 and went out to work. And so I was only getting like 10 shillings a week, something like that. But Mum always had money. She always put money aside for insurance and, to put the shillings in the meter so that we could get gas and stuff like that. But she would help, and she'd say, no, if you want it, we'll buy it online. It was like you pay. It was a catalogue that people brought around, and you'd pick something, and then you'd put a little deposit, maybe a couple of shillings or something, and then you'd have to pay every week until it was gone. Much like credit here, but a very simple form of credit, and we weren't paying interest on anything. It was just they're paying. This is the amount you're going to pay. So it was a very simple form of credit, but that's how we got all our clothes during my growing up years in England. But Mum was absolutely wonderful. She kept us going through very, very, very difficult times. And now I'm writing my memoir. I'm dedicating it to her because I think she had a vein of strength that I wasn't aware of at the time. But now looking back, I don't know how she did it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so Joy, just to chime in, because I just wanted to know, in terms of that move to Canada afterwards, was that like a turning point? How was that in terms of moving from England to Canada at that time?
We were happy to do it. We didn't really have, we wanted to go to, I think we were looking at New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. Now, we could have gone to New Zealand without paying anything, but they wanted us to stay in jobs for 2 years, no matter what it was. And we thought, no, maybe we better try and save up money to go to Canada, where they did not have that rule. So I took 2 extra jobs on in addition to daytime. I did bartending in the evening, and weekends I went and worked on race courses on the tote, paying at the winnings. So I earned enough money for Mum and I, to emigrate. And the boys emigrated separately. Alan came to Vancouver and rented a house. So Mum and I went there. Ian and his wife went to Hamilton, Ontario, and Colin never emigrated. He stayed in England. So what was it like? Well, I cried when I said goodbye to England on the boat when I realized that this was it. We were going to a new country, and I thought, oh my God, will I ever see? And, in spite of the bad times, I still love England with all my heart. At first, it was heartbreaking, but then it was quite exciting to land in Montreal and go across through the Rocky Mountains to Vancouver. So that was, all part of the excitement and another part of the world to see. And it was difficult settling because even though we spoke the same language, there was still a lot that we had to get used to in Canada. But eventually, I got jobs right away, which was wonderful. So I was bringing money, and Mum didn't work, and she didn't settle. She wanted to go back to England and be with her family there. So by the time I'd met Mike, I met him in February of 59, and we got married in May. It was a blind date that somebody set me up with because, I was a new immigrant and very not unhappy, but just still really missing England. And Mike was an immigrant too, and he'd been there a little longer than me. And we just hit it off. The first date we hit it off, and he said, "Oh, I think I'm going to marry you," and I said, "No, I'm never getting married. I'm just going to enjoy life." But he wore me down eventually, and eventually I said, "Yes, I think we should." We had no money. There was no point in waiting. We were earning, and the money was going into the house to pay for day-to-day living. So we got married, and when we came back from our honeymoon, I think we had $2, which we spent on Chinese food. So we started from there and just started to build our life together. We had, lived in a furnished rented place in Vancouver, and moved on to slightly better places. And then I was working well in Vancouver. It was a woman's world at that time. There was plenty of jobs, but Mike was a metallurgist and very good at his job. And he wanted to progress, so he got a job in Ontario, in Welland, Ontario, with Atlas Steels. So I think we had just a couple of possessions, because we were in furnished places. So we piled it all into a little truck that he bought and drove across country. We went through part of Canada and then part of the States. So we saw a good bit of the United States on that trip. We ended up in Welland, Ontario, lived there a while. He was transferred to Quebec. So we had 3 years in Quebec where the first baby was born. And I learned a little bit of French. I stayed with the French community because they were just a fun-loving bunch. And the Anglos were into golf, which I don't play, into baking cookies. I don't bake. So, I wasn't going to make cookies. I couldn't. And what was the other one they did? Something else. It was golf and cookies. And anyway, it was not something I was involved in. Oh, playing cards. And I said, no, I don't play cards. I like to talk to people.
Yeah.
I learned a little bit of French. I went to night school, learned some French, and Mike was working with a group of French-speaking men, and their wives used to call me on the phone and have little conversations. And eventually, we had that was our social life, was with the French Canadians in Quebec, and it was wonderful. I learned their culture. They even took us ice fishing, into their cabins all over the place. So that was great. From there, we were transferred back to England. So We had time in England again, and then they wanted him back. We had another baby in England. And then we came back. They transferred him back to Ontario again, and we lived in Fonthill. We've lived in Oakville. We've lived in Fort Erie and Welland. So we've lived in 4 places in Ontario.
So Joy, I just want to fast forward to your travels and how, in terms of your solo travels afterwards and especially now, and how, that evolved, and how do you finance your travels?
Well, after Michael died in 2015, I sold the house in Victoria, and I got a very good price for it. I couldn't afford to move back anywhere in Victoria, so I moved up island to a totally new community. That gave me a little savings, okay? Because I was able to buy the house here outright. So I had a little savings. So that was my travel and renovation fund for the house.
Right.
But all through my years with Mike, sometimes we traveled together. He traveled for 39 years with this job, okay, all over the world. And I was in the conference industry, so went to a lot of conferences in various places, and sometimes had a roommate, sometimes not. I went to Australia on my own for 6 weeks and went to New Zealand and rented a car and drove around there. I've done a lot on my own, really, because Mike did enough traveling with his job. He didn't want to do it. So I said, well, okay, I'm going to do it. And he said, yeah, go for it, Yeah. He was not one of those men that says, no, you can't, you've got to stay home and, raise the babies. But even though I was raising children, we would take the children on trips many times. I think we went 25 times to England, during those years to let them know where we were from and, to get back to their roots. But, when I turned 65, I went to Scotland and did a whole look back at life during the war, every place I'd lived. And that was very cathartic. I mean, I came back feeling that I didn't have anything to be ashamed of.
Yes, absolutely. And, as we're talking about the finance part of traveling and how you pulled it off. I know you took the personal financial identities quiz and you got your result. Yeah. And I really want to hear about that and how you think about, even now with money, and given what you've said so far in terms of living through the war and all that you've been through, what you saw with your mom and how she had to make ends meet. Can you just hear what your quiz results were and just give us like a feel for?
Yeah, the quiz results, I was very honest, and it turned out that I'm a minimalist. I didn't think I was, because I always thought, well, I'm a big spender, and my downfall has always been clothes. Because of being so poor and scruffy as a child, I thought it's not going to happen to me now as an adult. So I always make sure I'm well turned out. But Mike was the one who really turned me on to saving early. As soon as we got married and we were both working and settled, we got our retirement plans in place and put them. So it's always been there. The RSPs have been there, for me to think, oh, I'm going to be okay. But I only made my plan when I talked to my financial advisor way back till 90. I said, just figure everything out so I've got income till 90, because I doubt I'll be alive then. But now I wish I'd done it to 100, because we're all living longer now.
Absolutely. That's amazing, though, that you even had the foresight to tell him to do it until 90. And so is it that you had the RRSPs were in place and then you said to him, well, give me a withdrawal rate every year. I'll live on this much until 90. Is that what you did?
Yes. I just said, wherever you put the money. And there was some investments, which I did cash in when COVID came around because I was losing some money. And I said, no, I'm not a big risk taker. So let's cash that in and put it in the savings, which I did at that point. That was just one little bit. But, there's GICs, which are very helpful. They, they boost my income a little bit. So when I'm looking now, when I travel, to get deals, because I don't know, I've still got some savings. Yeah. So it's specifically now for travel, because I don't think I'm going to be doing much more to the house. So it's, it's there, and I think I will be okay. My focus back then was, working and putting money in the savings and in the RSPs and the TFSAs, which we did, both of us. We did that. And, when he died, I thought, okay, but I'd already learned before he died, because he had some dementia, and he was wonderful at figures and math. So I had to take that over, which I did. So I learned how to do that in, I guess, my 70s.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So, these days, my focus is on not spending a great deal on any one trip.
Yes.
I'm looking, I really don't want to keep paying a single supplement. I've done it a lot, but I don't really want to do it anymore. Unfortunately, the travel industry is starting to look at solo travel more than they ever did, in years past, when it wasn't totally normal for a woman to go off on her own. But I've kind of always done that and gone off on little trips here and there, and in the conference industry, the conference could be anywhere, which I would want to go to, because that was what I was doing. And my training when I decided to quit work at, I think, 55 and, open a business, which I did, and it was successful.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, protocol and etiquette and that kind of training, because I had done meetings in my job, and it was a government job, which I absolutely hated. I hated the environment.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yes, it was. I hated it, but they used to tell me I worked too fast, and you've got to slow down a bit because you're making everybody look bad. But aside from that, I opened my business, and fortunately got some great publicity, because I had a friend in Canadian press who kind of put it out there across the country. So had and that was in the 50s. I was in my 50s, 55 to when I was 60. I